Sagittal plane of gait. So first we're going to start off with initial contact, which is at 0% of the stance phase. You're going to be at 0 degrees, and then 20 degrees of hip flexion. The line of gravity is going to be anterior, anterior, posterior. You're going to want to activate your hip extensors concentrically, your knee flexors concentrically, and then your dorsiflexors eccentrically. For foot flat, which is 0 to 8% of the stance phase, you're going to be at 15 degrees of hip flexion, 15 degrees of knee flexion, and 5 degrees of plantar flexion. We are going to be at, the line of gravity is going to be anterior, posterior, posterior. You're going to want to activate your hip extensors concentrically, your quads concentrically, and then your dorsiflexors as well as concentrically. There is going to be one exception between initial contact and foot flat, and that's going to be at the knee, and that is due to the line of gravity changing so rapidly, so you're going to want to activate your quads eccentrically. Now for mid-stance, which is 30% of the gait cycle, you're going to be at 0 degrees, 5 degrees of flexion, 5 degrees of dorsiflexion. You're going to be posterior. This is very similar to stance, to posture. So posterior, line of gravity, anterior, anterior. Now we're going to want to activate our hip flexors eccentrically. You're going to want to activate your knee flexors eccentrically, and you're going to want to activate your plantar flexors concentrically. There's going to be another exception from foot flat to mid-stance, and that is due to the line of gravity changing so rapidly at the ankle, so you're going to want to activate your plantar flexors eccentrically there as well. Now for heel off, which is from 30 to 40% of the gait cycle, you're going to be at 10 degrees of hip extension, 0 degrees, 0 degrees. Line of gravity is going to be posterior, anterior, anterior. You're going to activate your hip flexors eccentrically, your knee flexors concentrically, and then your plantar flexors as well as concentrically. Now at toe off, which is 60% of the stance phase, you're going to be at negative 20 degrees of hip extension, then 30 degrees of knee flexion, and 20 degrees of plantar flexion. It's going to be, the line of gravity is going to be posterior, posterior, anterior. You're going to want to do hip flexors concentrically, knee extensors eccentrically, and then dorsiflexors concentrically. Next, I'm going to be explaining the frontal plane of view for gait. So for initial contact, we're going to be at 0 degrees of neutral. So you're going to want to activate your eccentric glute med because you're going into more adduction, and at the ankle you're at 5 degrees of inversion. For foot flat, we're at our max adduction, which is 5 degrees. So now you're going to activate your concentric glute meds or your concentric glute abductors. And then your ankle is going to be at 5 degrees of eversion. For mid-stance and heel off, you're going to be moving into more hip abduction, so you're going to activate your concentric glute med. And then for mid-stance, you're at ankle 5 degrees eversion, as well as heel off 5 degrees of eversion. Now for toe off, you're at the max abduction, which is 5 degrees, and your ankle is at 10 degrees of inversion for push off, which is 40% of your overall gait cycle. I'm going to be explaining now. So for acceleration, which is between 60 and 75%, you're at 20 degrees of hip flexion, 60 degrees of knee flexion, 10 degrees of plantar flexion. You're going to activate your hip flexors concentrically, knee extensors eccentrically, and then dorsiflexors concentrically. Now for mid-swing, which is 75 to 85% of your gait cycle, you're at 30 degrees of hip flexion, 30 degrees of knee flexion, 0 degrees neutral at the ankle. You want to activate your hip flexors concentrically, knee extensors eccentrically, and then dorsiflexors concentrically. From mid-swing to deceleration, the muscles change a little bit, so the deceleration is 85 to 100%. You're going to be at 30 degrees of flexion, 0 degrees, 0 degrees. You're going to do hip extensors eccentrically, knee flexors eccentrically, as well as your isometric dorsiflexors because your ankle is not changing from mid-stance deceleration to initial contact. The two types of compensations that I will be talking about today is a hip hike and a foot drag. So first, a hip hike occurs during initial and mid-swing, and it could be due to hip extensor tightness, and therefore she doesn't have enough hip flexion. A second compensation is foot drag, and this occurs during swing phase, and it just means when her foot drags on the floor, and this could be from improper control or weakness of your anterior tib or spastic plantar flexor. Two types of abnormal gait patterns are Trendelenburg and steppage. For Trendelenburg, you're going to see an excessive pelvic drop during swing phase of, say it's her right leg of her right leg, and this could be due to weakness and poor control of her contralateral glute med and poor hip stability of her glute med during swing phase. For a compensation, she is going to deviate towards the stance leg in order to keep the center of gravity over her left leg in that example. And then for steppage is when you observe a foot drag, so the patient will excessively hip flex in order to clear that foot. So you technically have a weak anterior tibialis.